It's our pleasure and honor to welcome all of you here at IMHPJ 2022 Annual Conference. IMHPJ members are thrilled that Darian Leader accepted our offer to come, and deeply grateful that he accepted to personally share his views with us. In 1985, Darian Leader co-founded the Center for Freudian Analysis and Research. He defended his PhD doctorat d'etat in Paris 8 University in 1992. He was an honorary visiting professor at Roehampton University, 2008-2016, Mercier Chair at Louvain University, 2015, and Freud Museum trustee from 2014 to 2021. Darian Leader practices and teaches psychoanalysis in London. If I'm not wrong, it's been 3 decades that of the anniversary of your office in London. And today you will speak about interpretation. Darian Leader, c'est à vous.
Great. So first of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to Nicholas for inviting me to speak with you today. Also to Professor Matsumoto and to all the members of the IMHPJ for participating in this meeting. And it really is an honor to be able to have a dialogue with you today. I obviously don't know much about how you work there and what your theoretical orientations might be, but hopefully that's something that will become clearer as we discuss and talk about what might be shared clinical and theoretical problems, or what might turn out to be a very different set of questions. So the theme I'm going to speak about today is interpretation. It's obviously a theme that cuts right across different psychoanalytic and psychotherapeutic traditions. Every clinician who's confronted with a suffering person is faced with the question, how are they going to respond? What are they going to do to alleviate the person's distress, or to allow them to speak further, or to shift a troubling symptom? Whatever the particular paradigm or the particular ideological perspective that the therapist, the clinician has, there'll always be the question of how are we going to respond? And this is something that in our market-driven societies is perhaps becoming more and more acute. When we meet young therapists, young analysts who are starting their practice today, they often feel that their patients, who are now obviously known as clients, to emphasize the market aspect of what's seen as a kind of transaction rather than perhaps the older idea of a relationship, they have the idea that since the client is paying for a service, they have to provide something, they have to give something to the patient. And this generates all sorts of problems, which usually it takes some time to get through. But there's a kind of increasing pressure, which young clinicians report, or people starting their practice today report, that they have to provide something to the patient. They have to kind of give something back because they're being paid to do something. They have to act, they have to operate in some way. And that question of what they give so often tends to crystallize around the question of interpretation of their words, what they say to the person that they're working with. Now, in psychoanalysis, Freud doesn't have too much to say about interpretation when he starts to define the technical apparatus of psychoanalysis. And he does that most of all in between 1911 and 1914 in a set of short papers that are known as Freud's technical papers. In those articles, when you read them now, you see that what Freud is actually doing is trying to instruct analysts on what not to do rather than on what to do. The articles on technique are more about a set of dangers to avoid rather than actual concrete prescriptions about what the analyst has to do. He's warning people of the pitfalls, the passion to understand too quickly, the passion to provide meaning, the passion to cure a patient, to help a patient. And he's warning against all of those things, which he argues get in the way of creating an atmosphere where an analysis can be conducted properly, which for Freud at that time meant the accessing and eliciting and articulation of unconscious material. So he's never emphasizing that the goal of analysis is to cure a patient or to get rid of a symptom. So very different perhaps from some of the ideas we might have today. It's purely the accessing and articulation of unconscious material and everything that might follow from that. Now, without going through all the details of what Freud does have to say about interpretation in these papers and elsewhere, I'd like to just take two different points. You could say two different ends of a spectrum. The first, Freud's early view from 1905, which is very clear in the Dora case. And secondly, a late paper he wrote in 1937 called Constructions and Analysis, which still makes for a remarkable reading today, full of insight and rich in ideas. In the first of those texts, the monograph on the Dora case, 1905, Freud describes what he calls switch words. And these will be words in what a patient is saying, which if we focus on them, if we give a weight to the word, we find that it allows us to switch from what the patient might be saying with some kind of conscious intent to another level of their speech, to an unconscious train of thought. And the key here is for the analyst to manage to extract the switch word from what the patient is saying, to convey to the patient the importance of the word and how it might then act as a junction to move on to other, perhaps less accessible ideas. And the example, or one of the most famous examples in the Dora case, is the word fire in Dora's first dream. Freud emphasizes the word fire and gets her to say more and more about it. This leads very swiftly to ideas of water, the opposite of fire, and then ideas of wet, which are linked to early memories of bedwetting and the idea of what's wet in a sexual encounter. So by emphasizing the word and pushing the person to free associate to it, we can hopefully access memories and other trains of thought that might be less accessible and perhaps more disturbing for the person to talk about. I'll give you another example. Let's say a person is telling you about their life situation and they find themselves in a particular encounter at work where their boss tells them to do something. And as they're describing this situation, they tell you that they weren't able to say no. Yeah. And you might hear this in a particular way, given what the person has already said about their history. And by emphasizing that particular phrase, I couldn't say no, it might resonate with perhaps an earlier episode in their childhood when they'd felt they were unable to say no to an injunction from the parents, perhaps, or something that happened, some drama in the family, maybe even a sexual scene. So it's through extracting and emphasizing a switch word that this early idea of interpretation allows us to access other unconscious motifs. Now, let's move on rapidly to 1937, one of Freud's last papers, Constructions and Analysis. Now Freud has something very different to say. He focuses less on the early idea of switch words than on constructions, ideas of what might have happened in the childhood and the early history of a patient, which would allow us to situate their neurosis, their symptoms, their suffering with greater clarity. And Freud says something very interesting here. He says that basically the construction that the analyst conveys to the patient, so the interpretation that the analyst makes, what's of paramount importance is the effect of the interpretation rather than its truth. And he quotes Shakespeare here, the line from Hamlet, that the bait of falsehood has caught the carp of truth. In other words, it's a really quite radical idea. If you think about it, what Freud is saying is that what the analyst says can be even deliberately false. You can say something that you know even to be untrue to a patient, because what matters is if what you say can catch a truth. And often perhaps you need to move through falsehood in order to arrive at truth. And that's something that I'm going to come back to later on, that question of how what's false or artificial in some way might be very important for us in order to touch what's most real in the life of the person that we're working with. But given these two models, the switch words model and the bait of falsehood model, what we see is that neither of these models of interpretation is concerned with being correct, with being true. What matters is simply how it operates in the work to allow us to reach something else. Yeah, that's a very, very, very important point. Now, what happens after those technical papers? Something important happens in Freud's theory. I don't know how familiar you are with Freud's writings, but just to put it very succinctly, in Freud's early work and in the work of the early analysts, there's a kind of enthusiasm to find hidden meaning. You find the missing piece of the jigsaw, you unearth the childhood trauma, you unearth the fantasy of the patient, and this will have effects on their symptoms and on their life. By the early 1920s, Freud has got a much more sober view. He thinks that really what counts in the psychical economy are questions of self-sabotage, of masochism, of guilt, and a kind of mandate of suffering that most human beings experience. And so there's no longer the question of what is the hidden meaning of a symptom, but rather the question, in a way, of what unconscious satisfaction does a symptom bring, and what place does the suffering that a symptom bring have in the person's life. And I'm sure that those of you who work clinically will be very familiar with this in your work. You receive a patient and they're suffering a lot from a debilitating symptom, maybe a difficulty in their work life, their love life, their sexual life. And maybe at a certain point, you kind of figure out what the kind of source of the symptom might be. But whatever you do, the symptom stubbornly refuses to shift, it stays. And you might be led to the idea that perhaps the symptom has a certain function in the person's life, perhaps a certain function of sacrifice, a certain suffering that they feel obliged to undergo, to pay, a price they have to pay in relation to questions of guilt and debt in their family history, their childhood, and so on. Obviously, the contexts and the frameworks can be very, very different here. But very often we come back to this question, not of the meaning of the symptom, but of the function of the symptom. Now, what's very interesting is that the more that analysts began to confront this question from the 1920s onwards, right through to the 1940s and 50s, in popular culture, we see a kind of inverse process. That if you look at the movies, wonderful movies from the late 1940s and 50s, you'll see that nearly all of those movies which feature a psychoanalyst or a psychotherapist involve finding the missing piece of the jigsaw, the forgotten childhood memory that suddenly explains the person's symptoms, suddenly reveals everything, and the person gets better. So at the same time as popular culture is broadcasting this idea that the analyst's interpretation will find the missing piece of your childhood, what most of the analysts are actually saying in America and in Europe is that really it's not a question of the missing piece, and that we've moved away from the model of the analyst as what Richard Sturber called the libidinal detective. And what matters is less the hidden meaning of a symptom than rather questions of the origin, the timing, and the dynamics of the emergence of a symptom. Yeah. So that's really quite a different question. And by the early 1940s, many analysts, especially in America, were emphasizing that analysis and therapy in general are less about finding the hidden meaning of a symptom but rather about the skillful handling of the analytic relationship. And this is something that's, again, very interesting historically, and something that was quite surprising and even shocking to some of the early old school analysts. That if you look at a moment in analytic history, 1949, there's a big congress in Zurich where you have the new analysts, the new generation of analysts, and then you have the old generation of analysts meeting and talking about their cases. And for an older generation analyst like Michael Barlint, he was in a way horrified to see how things had changed. That for him, what mattered in analysis was free association, was paying attention to what the patient was saying, was following the patient's speech to access unconscious material. And yet what he's noting by 1949 is there's less attention to the patient's speech and less attention to the patient's symptom. And what's taken its place in some areas is a new paradigm, a new framework, which sees the here and now of the therapeutic relationship as the clue to the history of the patient's object relations, basically their early childhood that they can't remember. So sometimes subtly and sometimes less subtly, what you see is a movement away from following the details of the person's speech, let's say the switch words in the patient's speech, to accessing childhood material, but rather the analyst using their own words, their own conceptualizations of what's happening in the consulting room, what they think the patient is feeling, as a clue to what perhaps can't be remembered in the patient's childhood. Yeah. So to take up the example I gave earlier of the patient who has the experience where they find they can't say no, you might have a situation where that isn't actually what the patient says, but the analyst thinks that the patient isn't able to say no, and then interprets that back to the situation in their early history. And this is echoed in a quite striking way as well in the reduction in reported speech in clinical case reports. If you read case reports in the 1930s and 40s, you find a lot of reported speech. You hear the patient's words. As we move to the end of the 1950s and 1960s, you find less and less of the actual words of the patient. You find more and more the analyst saying the patient felt libidinal or angry. They're describing what they think the patient is feeling rather than using the patient's actual words so we can understand more about what the experience is for the patient and use those words to access the material. So it's a fundamental shift away from speech based on this paradigm that the key to early object relations lies in the transference, lies in the analysis of the transference from the analyst's perspective. And that's obviously echoed in the burgeoning in the 1950s and 60s of theories of countertransference. Now, Lacan intervened in this debate, especially in the mid to late 1950s, and he wanted to bring things back to the patient's speech. He was trying to encourage analysts not to understand their patients too quickly, not to impose meaning too quickly, not to think that their interpretation of transference was somehow a given, but rather to encourage a renewed attention to the words of the patient's speech, exactly as Freud had. And this involved for Lacan a certain formulation of dialogue, of a dialogic process going on in the work of analysis, which involved moving away from what he called the moorings of speech. When you have a conversation in everyday life, you have certain moorings. You might have eye contact, you might nod your head as you're talking, or to acknowledge what someone's saying. You might use your hands in a particular way to gesticulate while you're speaking or while you're listening. There are all sorts of conventions which regulate and frame everyday dialogue. And Lacan's idea was that obviously an analytic dialogue is different from an everyday dialogue, because what you're trying to do is initiate the patient into a different way of listening, a different way of hearing themselves, a different way of hearing what they're saying in their own words. And so to do that, you might have to break the everyday markers of dialogue. So for example, you might not nod your head. You might not use your hands in a particular way to gesticulate. You might not reply at certain moments. When the person says good morning to you, you might not reply back. If they say, how are you? You might not reply. Yeah? There are all sorts of ways in which one can try and move beyond normal dialogue. But Lacan's idea was that fundamentally what's at stake here, however the particular analyst does it with a particular patient, what matters is a kind of repunctuation or a reshuffling of meaning to allow the person to access their own speech in a different way. Yeah. And of course, the way we punctuate speech has huge effects on meaning. I'll give you an example. If someone says, I said I'm going to Kyoto to my mother, we can hear that in a number of different ways. Now, let's say the person is an analyst and they're going to see their girlfriend in Kyoto, and they've had a conversation with their mother, and they then report, I've said I'm going to Kyoto to my mother. Now, you could hear that in one sense. One punctuation would give, I told my mother about my forthcoming trip to Kyoto. Or, let's say, a very simple Freudian reading of that, the girlfriend perhaps evokes the patient's mother. And so in the grammar of the phrase, I said I'm going to Kyoto to my mother, in the odd grammar, by putting to my mother at the end rather than earlier on in the sentence, we could read some kind of recognition of the fact that there's a link between the girlfriend and the mother. Now, it's a very simple example. And the way that the analyst responds to this would involve a punctuating to draw the patient's attention to what that odd grammar might imply as to what's going on with their unconscious dynamics, the girlfriend, the mother, whatever it happens to be. Yeah. So it's a practice of punctuating, reshuffling meaning to allow the patient to hear themselves in a different way. And there's the famous New Yorker cartoon where two analysts meet in the street, each says good morning to the other, and then each goes off with a little bubble thinking, I wonder what they meant by that. Yeah. In a way, that's what we're trying to do in a large part of analytic work, to get the patient to start wondering what words mean, to rethink assumptions that they might have taken for granted. Yeah, a good morning is just a good morning, but actually maybe it means something more. Yeah, so it's to introduce this question of meaning as some kind of opacity or enigma in order to access unconscious material and to keep the motor of the analytic work going, the production of more material. Now, by the end of the 1950s, Lacan has rethought this view. He hasn't abandoned it at all. It's still the idea of analysis as involving a reshuffling of meaning, but something a little bit different has occurred. By the late 1950s, Lacan's come to the conclusion that unconscious desire, so the main component of the unconscious, is actually incompatible with speech. It actually can't be readily formulated in speech. Now, this might seem surprising if you're familiar with Lacan, the kind of famous aphorism, the unconscious is structured like a language, the unconscious is made up of signifiers, of words, of representations. By the end of the 1950s, there's the idea that, in fact, there's an incompatibility between unconscious desire and speech. At one level, we can understand this. It means that unconscious desire is always running in the interstices of speech. It's always in the cracks in discourse, in the slips. It's always somehow ungraspable. But there's perhaps a more complex theory of desire there. And there are two different ways that one can approach it. You could say that by an incompatibility, what we might mean is that unconscious desire is something that can never be assumed by a subject. If we're imagining, let's say, an Oedipal scenario, just to take a sort of simple Freudian example, the person that wants to go to Kyoto to visit his girlfriend, who is actually some kind of representation of his mother. Yeah, let's take the simplest Freudian example. Now, how might we interpret that if we think that unconscious desire can never be fully assumed by the person? In other words, there can never be a declarative sentence which says, I desire my mother, or in the Oedipal framework, I want to murder my father, to take the most kind of simplistic Freudian stuff. Yeah. So it's the idea that the unconscious isn't made up of building blocks of declarative wishes, but something much more complicated is going on. In a sense, the I of the speaker can never be in the same place as the wish. A bit like in the novels of Patricia Highsmith, where she'll spend 100 pages telling you about someone's desire to murder someone else, and they make all sorts of plans to kill them. And then just as they're about to kill them, the other person dies accidentally because a brick falls on their head from a building. Yeah. So it's as if there's a kind of disjunction between the wish and the I of intentionality. Yeah, it's something that Highsmith elaborates in lots of different and more subtle ways in her stories and her books. But it's this idea of the difficulty, even impossibility, of a wisher assuming their wish, that there's a kind of disjunction between the wisher and the wish. Yeah. Now, if you take that seriously, presumably that will have effects on how you address the person you're working with analytically. Now, there's another version as well of this idea, again, slightly more complex, which comes from Lacan's engagement with the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. And this is an idea which is, I think, absolutely topical for all clinical work, whether it's in analysis or in other clinical contexts. It's the idea that forms of human suffering are often based on, predicated on, certain impossibilities, the impossibilities to think through, to process human dilemmas of sex, of reproduction, of death, mortality, debt, exchange, all the things which structure, which generate, which close human life. Freud had argued early on in his article on the sexual theories of children that these are kind of stumbling blocks that children don't understand, and they invent sexual theories in the unconscious to make sense of them. Lacan and Lévi-Strauss argue that there are kind of blind spots, impossible points, and at those points of impossibility, we not only try and invent solutions, but more significantly, we run through different kinds of scenario which repeat a comparable impossibility. So let's say you're confronted with a certain impossibility. Let's say the impossibility of imagining that you were born of both a mom and a dad. You can't quite make sense. How do a man and a woman get together in order to have a baby? The kind of thing that we hear about, not just through adults, but through work with children. Now, there's the idea that that confrontation with something impossible to think can then generate symptoms and fantasies which also involve similar comparable impossibilities. You're kind of generating a lifelong set of impossibilities, or even impossible dramas in your life, which all play out different versions of that initial impossibility. Let me give you an example from the world of fairy tales. Yeah. It's quite a complicated idea, but hopefully that this will clarify it. Take the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood is going off to see her grandmother who lives in the woods. And her mother tells her to be careful, and she forbids her from speaking to anyone along the way. Now, off she goes with her basket of cakes. And on the way, she meets a dangerous wolf, and she engages in conversation with the wolf, goes to her grandmother's. The grandmother has been eaten by the wolf. A huntsman luckily arrives in the nick of time, kills the wolf, and everyone's okay. I think you know the story. But if we look at the substructure, we have two different ideas, at least, if we follow this kind of Levi-Strauss-Lacan idea. We have the initial maternal prohibition. You can't speak to anyone on your way to see grandmother. What actually happens in the story is, first of all, Little Red Riding Hood breaks the prohibition by speaking to a dangerous non-human, the wolf. But then she also encounters the woodsman on her way, who she doesn't speak to. So she obeys the prohibition in not speaking to a safe human on the way. So we have two different, what Levi-Strauss would call mythemes. And we could say that the unconscious desire is neither reducible to the first proposition, a girl breaks a prohibition by speaking with a dangerous non-human, nor in the second proposition, a girl obeys a proposition by not speaking to a safe human, but rather the unconscious desire is, in a sense, in the difference between the two propositions, a desire that we might hypothesize as being in the area, the locality of a girl's dangerous desire for an older man, or vice versa. Yeah? So we don't have a declarative sentence saying the girl desires the older man or the older man desires the girl. Rather, we have a set of relations which encrypt, which cipher what can never actually be said as such. Yeah? Now, if you take that theory seriously, or the earlier theory about the kind of failure to coincide of the wish and the wisher, that will obviously have implications for your practice, yeah, for how you're actually approaching the clinical work with the person in your office. And what we find when we look at different theories of interpretation, different examples of interpretation in analytic work and therapeutic work, we find that really the first question we need to ask is what kind of theory of desire, what kind of theory of the unconscious, and indeed what kind of theory of the symptom do we have which will ground and make sense and allow us to situate how we choose to interpret. So let's say you have a sort of early Freudian view, the kind of jigsaw puzzle view, that people's symptoms are based on things that they don't remember from early childhood. Let's say they've had a childhood experience, a disturbing experience, maybe a sexual experience, that they don't remember. There's an amnesia, but it could be remembered if the conditions are right. Now, that might lead you in the work to encourage the patient to remember something. Now, your interpretations might move in that direction of conveying to the patient the idea that there's something to remember. Yeah, so that will shape how you interpret. But let's say you have a different view of the unconscious, that it's made up of desire that can't be articulated in words. Presumably then you're going to be doing something different. And then come back to that point later on. Or if you think that childhood traumas can actually never be fully remembered, and that what the unconscious consists of are traces, markers of where a trauma had been rather than what a trauma actually was. Yeah. Again, that might have an effect on what you convey to the patient, how you engage with the patient. Yeah? The same with a symptom. If someone shows up in your office with, let's say, a debilitating symptom in their work life, their love life, or intrusive thoughts or phobia, if you think that the symptom is a kind of cipher, an encryption, some kind of disguised formation, that if you follow it closely, you'll be led back to a childhood trauma or fantasy or some hidden truth. That will be very different from if you think the symptom is the result of a faulty learning procedure. If you see the patient's symptom as being essentially a maladaptive behavior that needs to be corrected. Yeah? Again, that will affect how you approach the patient, what you say to them, how you engage with them. Do we see the symptom as a mistake that needs correction, or do we see the symptom as a bearer of a hidden truth, or the bearer of a question that we actually need to pursue rather than eradicate? And it can always be dangerous to try and get rid of a patient's symptom before we know what function it has for them. Yeah? Now, I thought I'd take two clinical examples here, taken from the literature, that show us different ways of approaching the symptom and how these different ways of approaching symptoms, how the interpretive strategies show us the kind of ideology, the theoretical preconceptions of the analyst. And the first is from the work of Selma Freiberg. I don't know if you are familiar with her. She's a remarkable American analyst who published some really extraordinary papers on clinical work with children, and also she did groundbreaking work on the formation of subjectivity in blind children. So I really recommend her work. And the first example comes from a case, quite a famous case from 1951, the analysis of a phobia in a child called Dottie. Dottie is a 7-year-old child who goes to see Freiberg. She's very defiant, she's very troublesome, she has terrible temper tantrums at home. The parents all have let's say, not the easiest relationship. The mother favors her younger sister, and the mother is very clear in her hostility, even hatred of Dottie. Now, Dottie comes along to her sessions. She's not brought by the parents. She takes the bus herself at 7 years old, which strikes Freiberg as quite unusual, the kind of autonomy of this little girl. And next to Freiberg's house, there's another house with a cute little dog outside. And the dog doesn't pose any problem. And when Dottie comes to her sessions every week, she says hello to the dog. It's never a problem. Now, at a certain point, the mother herself starts an analysis and totally out of the blue phones up Freiberg, and in what Freiberg describes as an astonishing outburst, tells Freiberg how much she hates her daughter, Dottie, and she says, "I'm afraid of what I might do to her." And Freiberg notes that in all her years of practice, she'd never seen anything like this kind of sudden, unexplained outpouring of hatred towards a child. And right after that, something very interesting happens. Obviously, Freiberg doesn't mention this to the child, but Dottie suddenly becomes very afraid of the dog. There's a crystallization of a dog phobia, which also means that the way in which she gets to and from the session is changed so she can avoid the dog. Yeah? There's this terror of the dog that comes at this precise moment. So there's a symptom, the crystallization of the symptom of dog phobia, which Freiberg is very curious about. And she immediately links it to what's happening with the mother and the idea that perhaps the mother's hatred of the child has suddenly become more palpable, more visible. And she tries to get Dottie to talk more about her mum and her, let's say, ambivalent feelings towards her. And if you work with children, you'll know that this is often a very delicate area, because if you encourage a child to elicit negative feelings about a parent, you're often on very dangerous ground, even if it's absolutely obvious that there's massive ambivalence. Very often, and especially for a female child, it's very, very difficult to assume that negativity, because it means putting in question fundamental supports of identification, in a sense to allow oneself to say how hostile one feels towards someone who is effectively grounding one's own identity. Yeah, so it's a very common problem. And Freiberg meets with a lot of difficulty. It doesn't really work. Dottie just says, I didn't hear what you're saying. She kind of blanks Freiberg's questions. Nothing's happening. At which point, Freiberg makes a very nice intervention. She says, what do you think I am? A dog that will bite you? Yeah. Now, the little girl hadn't said anything to link Freiberg to the dog. Freiberg had been trying to get her to talk about her mother. So she makes this intervention. And then immediately afterwards, in a sense, we find the real substance of the interpretation. Freiberg gets on the floor and starts howling and whimpering like what she calls a cowardly and harmless pooch, a cowardly and harmless dog. And it's from that moment onwards that the phobia resolves, the dog phobia goes away, and she's able to talk more about her conflicted relations to her mother, and the other Oedipal material emerges. Yeah, so we have a very nice clinical sequence. Freiberg writes another paper more than a decade later when Dottie comes back as a teenager to talk to her and finds out a lot more material. But what's very interesting in the sequence is that you see the kind of ideology of work in the late 1940s, early 50s, because even though the patient's mother had phoned Freiberg telling her how much she hates the daughter and she's scared about what she might do to her, Freiberg interprets the dog phobia as a projection of Dottie's own hostility to the mother rather than the mother's hostility to her. Yeah? When her own intervention, presumably, opts more for the second interpretation, because by suddenly playing out in front of her, by acting, doing this sort of theater of being a cowardly and harmless dog, she shows that this powerful, threatening, violent agency is actually in themselves wounded and lacking. You can say that where the intervention works is by putting the lack on the side of the mother. Yeah, it's putting the weakness, the woundedness on the side of the one who is supposed to embody violence and danger. Yeah, so we've moved it away from the little girl as victim to the mother as victim. Yeah, so it's a very nice intervention. Yeah, and it avoids declaratively saying to her, the dog represents your violence, or even the dog represents the mother's violence. You're avoiding a declarative propositional approach by using a little bit of theater, acting in, as it were, to convey a localization of woundedness or lack. Now let's take another example. This is from the American Psychiatric Association's textbook of psychoanalysis, and it's a kind of it's a very big book which gives you chapters summarizing the kind of gold standard of analytic theory, analytic technique. And it's a case of a patient in his late 30s, a guy who goes into analysis with an immediate and very concrete problem. He's been in a long-term relationship. His girlfriend wants to get married, but at the same time, he's been having a secret love affair for 10 years with a woman he desires sexually but doesn't love. And the girlfriend who wants to get married now is someone he loves but doesn't desire. So it's a kind of classical male splitting that Freud, of course, had a lot to say about. Now, I'll read you the salient points in this clinical sequence. So the analyst says, after the patient has described the splitting between the woman who's loved but not desired and the woman who's desired but not loved, the analyst says, if only the two women could be put together as one. Yes, says the patient, I've often thought that, but I've never found such a woman. The analyst says, perhaps such a woman doesn't exist, but perhaps you've got trouble putting the two types of relationship together into one. The patient says, what do I do? He wants kind of concrete advice as to what decision he should make. And the analyst responds with some very concrete advice. He says, have you ever tried being more sexual with the girlfriend or tried to get to know better your lover? The patient says, I've tried, but it hasn't really worked. The analyst says, has this always been true in your relationships with women? And this, of course, leads to a bit more material about his history. He then says that he can't respect any woman that he feels sexually free with and he feels his own sexuality would ruin his relationship with the friendship woman, and that friendship with the lover would be impossible because of the sex. So again, a very classic kind of male presentation of the splitting in love life. Now, this is where things get interesting. The patient then, after all this, reveals to the analyst that he started a simultaneous consultation with the female analyst. So while talking about the splitting in his love life, he's actually started a split consultation. So he's seeing both the male and a female analyst, and he's only now telling the male analyst about what's happening. The analyst asks the patient what comes to mind about this. And the patient then, in a very interesting sequence, tells a story about his car. And it turns out that in his car, he keeps not one spare tire, but two spare tires. Because if you find yourself on a lonely road at night, if the car goes over glass, it might get two flat tires. Then what would he do if he only had one spare? The analyst says, that sounds like an issue of safety. Perhaps it isn't that the other analyst is female, but with two analysts, you feel safe. Yeah. Again, this is a kind of classic thing that you find, especially with male analysands. They buy two of the same thing. Yeah. You might find something, it's often an article of clothing. The person buys two, and when you ask them, why have you bought two? They explain they're very worried that if the one article gets damaged, they won't have a replacement. Yeah, there's always on the horizon this idea of a kind of prospective bodily damage that has to be warded off or guarded against. Now, the analyst says, not wanting to depend on only one is a profound point and might apply to women and to analysts as well. So he's linking the tires to the question of the doubling of the analysts and the doubling of women in his love life. The patient says he does feel that way about women, in that his situation, he can't rely on his friendship woman for his sexual needs or his sexual partner for his friendship and love needs. Maybe there too, he says, each would have a different thing to give. And the analyst says, perhaps it's difficult for you to imagine and to accept that one person could give you both a man and a woman's view of sex and friendship. And it's very interesting there, because essentially what the analyst is doing is he's conveying to the patient, it's a little bit like, you know, in Plato's Symposium, the Aristophanic idea that a human being was originally just one huge sphere which got split in two, and we then spend our lives trying to look for the other half. He's got an Aristophanic vision of human life, that you just need to find one person that will complete you, that will give you everything you need, and that will combine love, friendship, sexuality, the male, the female analyst, the two tires, as if rather than recognizing with the patient a division, a splitting, a fracture, the analyst is working from, let's say, an ideological position of unity, and that one person could provide both of those things. And it's interesting to compare that with Freiberg's intervention, because Freiberg's intervention, in a sense, puts lack into the place of some kind of violence and aggressive potency in a way. This vicious dog that threatens Dottie becomes a cowardly and harmless pooch. Yeah. In the other case, we don't have an emphasis on lack or woundedness, what isn't there. Rather, we have the idea, which in a sense, one might argue, can only make the patient's symptoms worse, perhaps, with that kind of strategy of believing that one's answers could be found by combining the love and the sexuality, for example, the male and the female, or the two tires. So rather than recognizing that something's missing, that something is lacking, that something has a sort of wounded nature, to follow the kind of logic of Freiberg's case, we have a very different kind of interpretation here, where what's being conveyed to the patient is quite the opposite, that there could be the coexistence of these two different kinds of relationships in one. Now, we also have different styles of interpreting there. note how Freiberg kind of avoids telling things to the patient. She's doing a bit of play acting by getting on the floor on her hands and knees and whimpering like a cowardly pooch. Yeah? Now, in the other case, I'm kind of slightly caricaturing the analyst's interventions just for, to make the argument clearer. The analyst isn't as didactic as all that, but still you have the sense of an analytic sequence in which information is being conveyed to a patient. It's not as declarative as it sometimes is, but there are many clinical instances, there are many cases, there are many kinds of practice where the analyst or the therapist tells the patient things about themselves. Yeah? Now, that can be helpful for some people. Let's say in your childhood, you were neglected and no one paid any attention to you, no one had any interest in you. It might then be maybe a positive experience if you meet someone who listens to you, who takes the time to hear what you're saying, and then tells you things about yourself. Maybe that can help some people. But there are other cases where the person has grown up and their life consists of being told things. You are a wonderful kid, you are a terrible kid, you are good at this, you're bad at that. The way in which language, the language of our parents and our caregivers and our teachers shapes who we are. It constructs, it forges, it engineers our identity. And one could argue, certainly from Lacan's perspective, that what analysis does is it tries to separate us from all those things that have been said about us and that we've internalized to forge our identities or part of our identities. And so what analysis in part consists of is separating the subject from those signifiers and representations that have formed us, and that in many instances we ourselves have given an elective power to at moments when in our lives we've experienced maximum anxiety or dislocation. At those moments, which have been most difficult for us, we tend to appeal to certain words, certain self-images, certain representations, which would pin us down. And analysis, at least with neurotic subjects, is about unpinning that, exploring that, and separating the subject. In other words, it's the exact opposite of being told who we are. Yeah? So again, you see that if you have that view, that would automatically go against a style of interpretation where you're telling things to the patient about themselves. Yeah? And many styles of therapy today really revolve around that. As one of my analysands put it, she said that the previous therapy she'd done was a kind of, the very well-meaning and nice therapist was trying to engage her in a conversation about herself, as if she was sort of an object in the room that they were talking about, which she wasn't too pleased with. Now, let's just conclude.
Yes, let's conclude.
Outside the Lacanian world.
Yep. Just a moment. So the image and the sound froze when you were just saying, let's conclude. So please go ahead. Now it's okay.
Okay. Let's just conclude with some comments about Lacan's own practice in relation to what I've been saying today. Outside the Lacanian world, Lacanians are often caricatured as being obsessed with language, wordplay, crossword puzzles, humorous quips, and so on, as if this is what interpretation for Lacanians consists of. But when you look at examples of Lacan's own interventions with his patients, you find that some of them do involve word plays, a focus on the double meaning of a word. But the ones that seem to have had most impact, that are reported by patients that have written about their experience or talked about their experience later on, they always involve something theatrical, Lacan doing something with his body, with his voice, actually stepping in front of a patient to articulate something, Lacan impersonating the voice even of a parent of one of his patients, or Lacan moving in a strange way, or actually going out of his office to accompany a patient somewhere. And I won't go into the particular examples, but what you see is a very theatrical practice, very, very similar to the Freiberg example, where she gets down on her hands and knees and starts whimpering like a wounded, cowardly pooch. Yeah, I'm not saying, this is the kind of, the only way in which Lacanians interpret, but it's very important to see and recognize that theatrical dimension, especially if we return to what I was trying to articulate earlier on about the incompatibility of unconscious desire with speech. If that happens to be how we conceive of the unconscious, it would mean we can't put unconscious desire into any kind of readily understandable proposition or sentence. We have to find other ways to activate it, to access it, to invoke it, to work with it. And that brings us precisely to the question of theatre, because you can ask, Japan has got, a very rich theatrical tradition or traditions. We can ask, what role does theatre have in human culture? Why does theatre exist? Yeah? And if you look at the history of theatre in so many different cultures, you could argue that one of the main reasons theatre exists is to say things that can't be said in any other way, is to say things that can't be said directly. And you can think, for example, of the role of theatre in times of censorship or dictatorship in particular, but also, at all times, even in times when censorship is perhaps reduced, let's say in Elizabethan England. In all those times, you see a burgeoning of theatrical practices which show within culture a way of using language and the body to convey something, to point to something, to try to articulate something that can't be said in other ways. Yeah. And so to conclude, we could say that although there's always in analysis and in interpretation a dimension of deciphering, of unencrypting, of decoding, what Sturber had called the libidinal detective, there's always part of that work in analysis and therapy. You're always looking for, at some point, the hidden meanings, the childhood memories that couldn't be accessed. Of course, it would be silly to deny the importance of that dimension of analytic work. But there's also, as Lacan had emphasized, another dimension, which is less about deciphering the unconscious and the symptom and more about responding to it in a more theatrical way, a way which perhaps involves a coalescence of the body and language, in order to try to dramatize, to act in with the person we're working with a question about the desire of the other, to open up a space where an engagement with the unconscious and the positions that the subject had taken earlier in their life can be recognized and hopefully changed. I'll stop that. Thank you very much for your question and also for sharing about your own experience of your work and your own formation. And I absolutely agree with the importance of the context and the relationship. And of course, it's something which in today's market-driven societies, we risk losing more and more, because in today's world, human beings tend to be assimilated to units of production, energy, work capacity, sets of skills. And once you define a human being as a set of skills, of course, you can then swap them around. And it's interesting, if you read case reports from the 1950s and 60s, you find examples where the person is really, really upset that their bank teller changes. They go to the bank every day to do some kind of fairly anonymous transaction, and it's the same person that's always there. And then one day they've been swapped because the new person has got the same skill set. So from the point of view of the market, it's exactly the same. But of course, what the person's distress is registering is the fact that there's a relationship that's no longer there. Yeah. And so it's interesting to see how, as we've moved forward in the 20th and now the 21st century, that dimension of the relationship is perhaps, one of the only places it's still important is in the world of the therapies, the talking therapies, whereas the market forces that govern those therapies, certainly, when they're distributed and made possible by the state, finds it very difficult to register that fact. There's a big department store that's very popular in London called John Lewis. And their kind of ad line is, we don't offer a transaction, we offer a relationship with our customers. Yeah. So it's a little bit the opposite of the way things are moving today. If you're getting public health therapy, there's the idea, well, it's great if you can see the same therapist, but we couldn't substitute someone with the same skill sets halfway through for them to continue the therapy with. And it's the same, social services. There are lots and lots of examples where public services which rely on a human relationship are being redrafted and reformulated in terms of the effects of the market vision of skill sets, and the monetarization, the commodification of human performance. So in a way, all therapists and analysts share this common problem and share this value, in a sense, of the importance of the relationship. And in terms of the question of interpretation that we've been talking about today, by the mid-1940s, it was widely recognized that human beings change in therapy not through the powerful interpretation, the moment of insight, but through the nature, the quality, the longevity of the relationship. So it's something crucial. So I think we would all agree on that. Now, when it comes to the question of how interpretations change over time, and you talked about the time of the session and also the time of the work, there are different ways of responding to that. I think the most obvious way is to point out that in the Lacanian tradition, the actual time of the session is extremely variable. And so scanding the session, ending the session, is something that occupies the place of interpretation. So let's say if the patient had said, to use the example earlier, I said, I'm going to Kyoto to my mother, one might choose to end the session on that moment rather than actually try to unpack what the sentence might mean. In other words, on the side of meaning, one might cut the session at that moment in order to generate more material and more tension. And the analytic idea there comes from early 20th century psychology, a series of experiments, in fact, in Russia, which showed pretty convincingly that when a continuous thread of speech and memory is broken, that generates more material that had been difficult to access. Yeah? So it's the idea that rather than focusing on the provision of meaning, we're trying to reshuffle, to destabilize, to trouble received meanings. And by ending the session at particular times, the analysand is encouraged to go off and the work will continue in between the sessions. So in a sense, if you do a Lacanian analysis, and many other kinds of analysis as well, I'm sure, the encouragement is that the patient is doing the work all the time, not just in the sessions. Yeah. Now, how does that change, or does it change over the time of a therapy? I think that's something that varies from case to case. If one needed to generalize in terms of how Lacanian analysis is often formulated, you can say that there's a period prior to the analysis as such called preliminary interviews, where you sit face to face before the person goes on the couch, if they do. And in that period, one of the main aims of what the analyst says is to construct the biographical data of the patient, and crucially, to encourage them to recognize inconsistencies and contradictions in that account. And it's the idea that it's the engagement with those inconsistencies and contradictions that in itself facilitates the transference. Yeah? So someone might come with very little transference or transference directed somewhere else, and it's through a confrontation with those inconsistencies and contradictions that a certain transference will be generated. Then, hopefully, they'll be able to ask a new question about their symptoms, about their life, about their biography. And it's at that moment that we'd have a passage to the couch. Yeah. So those early interventions might be more pointing to the contradictions and inconsistencies. Then in the next period, once they go on the couch, we could be more at the level of the switch word or the theatrical intervention. You know, again, that depends on the case and what's happening, whether there's an inertia, whether there isn't an inertia. It's entirely variable depending on the case. And then at the end of treatments, I mean, treatments end in different ways. Most treatments don't end. The person exits the treatment before it ends. I think that's something we see in all different kinds of analysis and therapy. It's never conducted perhaps to the point at which one might hope it to be, you know, arriving at. Even if we don't know what that point is, we often have a sense that someone is leaving just a little bit too early. Someone exits when they've made an important connection or when they want to avoid an important connection. Something that you see in case reports, especially the autobiographical ones, in both Lacanian and non-Lacanian analysis, is that there are moments when the analyst tends to be much more candid about themselves. They might be showing their own lack or vulnerability towards the end of a treatment. In other words, to have some effect of deflation on the transference. But again, this is very variable. Some analysts are comfortable doing that and other analysts are less comfortable doing that. And there might be reasons in a particular case to avoid doing that or to accentuate it. So I think, you know, it's variable. Thank you for your kind words earlier and for your remarks and the question. First of all, let me say I agree absolutely with the idea that what we're doing is trying to allow the person we work with to have the freedom to create meaning. And you can say that some kinds of interpretation aim explicitly at that by mimicking in themselves the process of the creation of meaning. So if you make, let's say, a poetic or even an enigmatic interpretation at a particular moment or through a joke, what you could be conveying is the actual possibility of creating meaning from something else. And it's something that had always struck me in the work of Frieda Fromm-Reichmann in the 1940s, is absolutely, you know, worth reading today. She says that the interpretation in analytic work should be the prerogative of the patient, even more so than that of the analyst. You can imagine the kind of ripples that would have made in the 1940s, you know, especially coming from her. The idea that, you know, it's the patient that we should be encouraging to interpret rather than us imposing our interpretations on them. And especially given the idea that people's symptoms are perhaps in themselves already interpretations. Yeah, someone might have a symptom. Let's say, I talked about a case in London very recently. Someone had the idea that their vagina was a non-flexible tube. Now, that's an interpretation. Yeah, it's something created in childhood by the person. It's the creation of a meaning, the internalization of a particular image, which then generated a symptom because it meant for that person, it was very difficult to have the idea that anything could either enter or leave that space without damaging the body. So that would generate terrible anxieties and difficulties in that person's life about what they could and couldn't do based on an interpretation that this part of the body is interpreted as being the inflexible tube. Yeah. So in that sense, what we're trying to do is create a space where a new meaning can be created. But to do that, presumably, we have to facilitate a contesting of the initial interpretation. So we're working against meaning in one way in order to allow the creation of new meaning. Now, when it comes to the idea of countertransference, Lacanians aren't very good on this, I've got to say, because we have set responses. Whenever people ask about countertransference, I don't know if Nicholas agrees, we always say the same thing. We say, well, countertransference just means that the person needs to go back and do some more analysis themselves, and that we have a different idea, which we call the desire of the analyst, which is the desire to not know, to engage the patient with a point of non-knowledge. So there's always the idea that knowledge isn't enough to answer their questions and to keep the ball rolling, to keep material emerging for a certain time. Now, it doesn't seem to be really addressing the question of countertransference, but I think Lacanians would tend to separate the two different views of what countertransference is: the Freudian and Annie-Reichian view that countertransference is anything that interrupts the work of analysis, the transferential work, and the view that's more, post Heinrich Racker, that countertransference is an invaluable tool that you can learn from if you're able to reflect on and allow your cognitive processes to teach you something in the work. Yeah. Now, Lacanians would disagree with that latter view, however popular it is, and they'd think that really we're always running the risk there of imposing our own thought processes on the patient. But, there could be instances where, if you remember the Freud quote at the beginning about the bait of falsehood and the carp of truth, where discussing something or pitching something, putting something on the table that in a way we know to be wrong, but something that might have occurred to us might actually be helpful, because the person can say, actually, it's not that. And then that might trigger the emergence of something new, something else. But again, that will depend on the context and the moment of the treatment, because if the person is very prone to believe everything that their therapist or their analyst says, one might want to avoid doing that. But if a different kind of dialogue is possible, why wouldn't one, at a certain point, share something that comes to mind, as long as we know how to place it correctly, that we're not trying to impose it on the person, but as I think you were saying, to allow it to facilitate some new kind of creation.
Yeah. So I would definitely agree with that about, let's say, how to place correctly something that's on the side of countertransference. So let's say, because you just invited me to respond on the side of countertransference. Also, there's there's a book by Patrick Guillaumard about countertransference. So I think that let's say the notion, let's say the final statement on the notion is not yet found, even in the Lacanian field. So also what came to my mind when Lil used the word playfulness, which is obviously also what's interesting with your approach, Mr. Leader. I also find the word playfulness right in this case. And that's also what I try to do also in my own clinic, in my own approach. And it reminds me of the, let's say, the divide of the after Lacan's death. You see where there was what became after the Millerian group, which was on the side of explaining Lacan. And then the others, those who didn't participate to the École de la Cause Freudienne, were on the side of problematizing Lacan. So that there is this movement between explaining Lacan and problematizing it. So obviously one can combine both. And at the same time, because you explain the case with the two the two tires, I'm a little bit I don't know how to situate myself between explaining. Can we combine explaining and problematizing, or should we only situate ourselves on one camp? So I'll keep this open.
So let me just say something about the point you made about the explaining and the problematizing.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that has always been a difficulty for Lacanians is that we tend to get criticized by people that don't really know anything about Lacan. They haven't read it, they haven't studied it. So for us, it's very important to explain to people what it's about. But to do that, we have our kind of churches. And so once you enter the church, you have, things that are defined as your heresies, and you're supposed to agree with and broadcast the party line of the particular group that you're in, which doesn't leave a lot of room to problematize. But it always seems to me a bit better, if you're going to question Catholicism, it's better to be a lapsed Catholic yourself than someone from another religion. Yeah. So I always think, it's more fruitful to pass via the religion, to join the group, in order to be able to problematize it later on. Yeah. It is interesting historically that it's only very recently that Lacanians in France are beginning to sort of question some of the doctrines that they'd been transmitting previously.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of historical thing, and I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens over the next 10, 15 years.
May I ask another question for either Darian Leader or Nicholas?
Yeah.
So a bit about how Lacan understood language and the signifiers type vocabulary. I was wondering if either of you were familiar with relational frame theory, which is kind of a behavioral account, for cognition and language. It sounds really, really similar. And I want to admit that, I will be reading up on Lacan from now on. I haven't, read too much to this point. But when I read the little bit about the signifiers and how, it's all these, different relations that represent, the person and their world, it sounded a lot like relational frame theory. I was wondering if either of you were familiar with it and could comment on the overlap or anything like that.
Sure, and relational frame theory is very interesting and very important in making some of those aspects clear. In the work with the patient, for example, when the patient says that they're feeling something, if you're aware of relational frame theory, you'll be able to hopefully get the patient to realize that when they say I'm feeling X, it means I'm telling myself X. Yeah. In other words, feelings can be broken down into examples of self-talk, which is exactly, I think, an idea, I don't know if Nicholas would agree, which is shared by Lacanians. The idea that so many of our ways of thinking, behaving in the world are formed by internalizations of talk and self-talk. Now, there's an agreement there, but then what we do with that, I think there might be some divergences in terms of how we respond to it therapeutically and how we conceptualize changes that might occur through the work. So I've been a big critic of cognitive therapies, although I quite often refer patients to certain types of cognitive therapy. I think, ACT is amazing for some people, absolutely brilliant. But that doesn't stop me from disagreeing with how some of those therapies conceptualize what they're doing. So they can work very well, but we could have a kind of Lacanian understanding of why they work well and not necessarily endorsing their own understanding that. But I'm all for, a diversity of therapies and, encouraging people to access those therapies if it's going to be helpful for them. But so the theory of language in Lacan, we think it's really sophisticated, but actually it isn't. It is very simplistic. And it is an interesting historical question. Lacan spent a lot of time in the 50s encouraging people to link psychoanalysis and the study of language. But he didn't really go very far. And I think by the early 60s, he kind of gave up the idea. I mean, he still would say the unconscious is structured like a language, but he wasn't that interested in the work in following the work of contemporary or even older linguistics. So I think it's still a very rich field of research that hopefully analysts will take more of an interest in. Yeah, I think when Lacan uses that phrase, for the first time. I think it's in the article, The Direction of the Treatment and the Principles of Its Power. What he means is that we should read the dream literally. In other words, we should pay attention to the words in order to follow desire. And the classic example in that paper is the dream of the butcher's wife, the caviar and the smoked salmon. I think you're perhaps familiar with the dream. So it's about not injecting meaning, but actually following the particular signifiers, the concrete signifiers in the person's discourse in order to track desire. Now, that's in a sense the first meaning. You've also got references to the idea of the letter in Lacan, which start from, as far as I remember, the seminar on the purloined letter, so earlier, before the direction of the treatment, where there's a kind of equation between the letter and what he calls from alchemy the caput mortem, a kind of residue. Later on, Lacan's theory of the letter will involve the idea of a kind of coalescence of the signifier and what he calls jouissance, which I think is an unfortunate concept, but anyway, to suggest a kind of frozen mark that's outside the field of meaning, that always, in a sense, returns to the same place, and that maybe in analytic work can be dialectized and brought back into the circuit of speech. But looked at from that point of view, the letter is that which doesn't enter the speech circuit, which always remains the same, and which marks some kind of traumatic point or point of great enjoyment or great anxiety for the subject.